time to hand over to our three experts. If I could ask Jim Curran to come up. Jim's a former teacher, and he's a firm abolitionist of academic selection, and it's actually his talk that made me write that. Thank you very much, Jim.
I'd like to begin by thanking Anna Marion and the Reclaim the Enlightenment Committee for the invitation to speak here today. When I checked through the list of notable speakers, I felt a bit like Geoffrey Canada, the American educationalist and the driving force behind the Harlem Children's Zone. And when he was asked to give a TED talk, he told his wife Yvonne, and Yvonne said to him, "Geoffrey, would you have to realise these are very smart, talented people?" And I feel a bit like that today. My talk is on how the education system has failed the working class. I begin with a quote from Eliot. "The function of schooling is to preserve the class and select the elite." Only one of my four grandparents could read or write, and that was my maternal grandmother. Now, I'm not sure whether or not she went to school, but there aren't any of my other three grandparents could read or write. And during the Second World War, they had my daddy's family. During the Second World War, they had three sons in the armed forces. And my grandparents, they lived away in the middle of the country. My uncle Brenny was a rear gunner, and his plane was shot down over Norway on a mission to bomb the German battleship, the Tirpitz, in 1942. And the telegram boy, of course, arrived at the house. Neither my granny or granda could read, and the telegram said, "Your son Brenton is missing in action, presumed dead." And one of the older girls in the house, Mary, she had to read the telegram to them. Now, fortunately, that wasn't the case. He was in a German prisoner of war camp, and he arrived home at the end of the war in 1945. I used to think that the fact that my grandparents couldn't read or write, I used to think it was unusual and that they were the exception, but not so. Andy Green, in a survey of the rise of educational systems in England, France, and the USA, singles out England as the most blatant example of the use of schooling by a dominant class to secure control over subordinate groups. When the English state schooling system was set up in the late 19th century, the intention of the dominant classes was still to police and control the working class. Robert Lowe, writing in 1867, represented the views of the vast majority of the middle and upper classes when he argued, "If the lower classes must be educated, they must be educated that they may appreciate and defer to a higher civilization when they meet it." In his fascinating book, Outliers, author Malcolm Gladwell introduces us to Christopher Langdon. Christopher Langdon had an IQ of 195. Einstein had an IQ of 150. And Christopher Langdon was once described as the smartest man in America. And Christopher Langdon spent all his adult life working as a nightclub bouncer. Chris was one of 4 brothers. Each had a different father. Chris was the eldest. The family was very poor. After high school graduation, Chris went to university at Reed College in Oregon. He lost his scholarship because his mother forgot to fill in some forms, and he had to leave without taking any exams. As he points out, the university administration were less than helpful and seemed unconcerned by his situation. After 2 years working in construction, he was able to enroll at Montana State University, where he enrolled to study mathematics and philosophy. He was living about 13 miles outside the town. And when the old car that he had, when it broke down, and he had a couple of early morning classes, he needed to get his timetable changed. One of his neighbours said that he could leave him in for 11 o'clock any morning. So he needed to go and to see his advisor of studies about the changes to his timetable. But the advisor, after checking his record at Reed College, and even though he hadn't sat any examinations, he had 4 Fs for failed. So the advisor of studies then thought that he's a bit of a waster. And this is what he said to Christopher. "Well, son, after looking at your transcript at Reed College, I can see you have yet to learn that everybody has to make sacrifices to get an education. Request denied." So I went to the dean. Same treatment. In some respects, the young Robert Oppenheimer was a lot like the young Chris Langdon. They were both highly gifted and both had very high IQs, but here the similarities end. As a young child, Robert Oppenheimer was raised in one of the wealthiest neighbourhoods in Manhattan. The family travelled in a chauffeur-driven car, and his summers were spent on the continent with his grandfather. When he was 12, he was invited to give a talk to geologists at the New York Mineralogical Club. Robert went to Harvard, and then he went to Cambridge to do his doctorate. And when he was at Cambridge, he had a disagreement with his tutor, who was Patrick Blackett, who would go on to win a Nobel Prize in 1948. He had a disagreement with his tutor over what type of physics he should be studying, and Robert got very down and very depressed. So one day, he took some chemicals from the laboratory and he tried to poison his tutor. It's just a bit extreme. His tutor became suspicious, as you would, and the university authorities called in the police. After much negotiation, well, his parents flew over right away, but after much negotiation, it was agreed that Robert would be put on probation and have regular sessions with a prominent Harley Street psychiatrist. Robert Oppenheimer went on to head the Manhattan Project, the American effort to develop the nuclear bomb during World War II. So one student tries to get his timetable changed, and he had his scholarship taken away. The other student tries to poison his tutor, and he's sent to see a psychiatrist and allowed to continue with his studies.
Diane Ray, Professor of Education at Cambridge, was the oldest of 8 children, brought up, in her own words, on a Sink Council estate. And she was a free school meals pupil throughout her schooling. She was, yes, I said, one of 8 children. She recalls her first day at school. And I'm just going to read basically her description. I want you to picture a scene in a small town primary school on the edge of the coalfields in Derbyshire in the mid-1950s. A little girl of barely 5 years old has been gently pushed through the gate by a harassed mother with a baby in a pram, a 2-year-old plonked on top, and a crying 3-year-old clutching the bar at the side of the pram. The mother rushes off. The little girl is already late, and it's her first day at school. She cautiously makes her way to the front entrance, and a kindly secretary ushers her into the reception classroom. Lingering at the door, the little girl immediately notices a number of things. First, Roy Machin and Raymond Wilson, 2 boys from her council estate, are sitting at a table laboriously copying the letters on a sheet of paper. Doris and Edith, also from the estate, are sitting opposite them. Her eyes swivel to take in the classroom. At the other table, unknown children are reading. The little girl instantly recognizes the books, the very familiar Janet and John reading series. She and her mother have been reading the books since she was 3, and she'd already started teaching her younger sister to read book 1. The teacher looks up, smiles and asks her name, then walks over to the desk to check the register. "Sit over there," she says, pointing to a seat between Roy and Doris. The little girl hesitates. She wants to read. And anyway, she can write the alphabet on her own. She doesn't need to copy it. The little girl's father told her 2 things about school. Be polite and put your hand up when you ask anything, and always speak up if things are unfair. She puts her hand up. The teacher frowns, a twinge of irritation fleeting across her face. "Yes?" she inquires. The little girl says very slowly and solemnly, "Please, miss, I can read. Can I sit at one of the other tables?" The teacher's frown deepens. "You sit where you are told." The little girl reluctantly slides into her chair, but refuses to pick up her pencil, stung by the unfairness of it all. She wrestles with herself and fidgets until the teacher comes across and this time raises her voice. "What on earth is the matter with you, child?" The little girl looks up and says, "But miss, I can read," and is made to stand in the corner with her face to the wall for her insolence. The 1944 Education Act, England and Wales, the Butler Act, which became law here in Northern Ireland in the Northern Ireland Act 1947, provided free education for all children aged between 5 to 15. As in England and Wales, an academic selection test at 11 determined whether a child could attend a grammar school with an academic focus or a secondary school with a more vocational focus. The Act renewed the promise to tackle working class underachievement, but it turned out to be very much a false promise. As Halsey, Heath and Ridge found in their research, which spanned the 1930s to the 1970s and assessed the progress made by grammar schools up to 1972. They concluded that school inequalities of opportunity had been remarkably stable over the 40 years which our study covers. Throughout, the middle class has had roughly 3 times the chance of the working class of getting some kind of selective secondary schooling. Even those working class children who did get to grammar school were frequently relegated to the bottom set on the basis of ability. So little had changed since the Education Act of 1870, where we had elementary schools for the poor, secondary schools for the middle classes, and private schools for the upper classes. With the 1944 Education Act, now we had secondary schools for the working classes, grammar schools for the middle classes, and private schools for the upper classes. The 11 Plus was introduced by the government of the day, Churchill's wartime government, and it was done so in good faith, with the government believing that the research had been done and that it was based on good science. We now know that this was not the case. Sir Cyril Burt, an educational psychologist who at the time was the chief government statistician, was instrumental in the establishment of the test, which was largely based on his research involving identical twins reared apart. Burt believed that intelligence was inherited, that it was fixed, and that it could be measured. It's now widely accepted that Burt's beliefs were not matched by the research evidence. Soon after Burt died in 1971, academics re-examined his work. Results were too neat. Researchers failed to replicate his findings. Suspicions multiplied, and in 1976, Dr. Oliver Gilly, the medical correspondent to the Sunday Times, who was also suspicious of Burt's work, began to investigate. He set out to find 2 of Burt's research assistants, Miss Margaret Howard and Miss Jane Conway. Despite a thorough search, he was unable to locate either, and he was forced to conclude that they were fictitious names. This fact, in conjunction with other findings, led Gilly to conclude that Burt had falsified his data. The article, which appeared on the front page of the Times, October the 24th, 1976, began with these lines: "The most sensational charge of scientific fraud is being levelled against Sir Cyril Burt." In the 1960s, growing evidence of the negative impacts of academic selection at 11, particularly about the lower attainment in secondary schools, led to the introduction of comprehensive post-primary education in England in 1965. However, the abolition of the grammar schools was strongly opposed in Northern Ireland, and so selection at 11 continued. As Pivotal have pointed out in their literature review about the impacts of academic selection, the Troubles dominated this period of Northern Ireland's history. After the Good Friday, the Belfast Agreement in 1998, the establishment of a new devolved Northern Ireland Assembly, the debate surrounding academic selection again came into focus. The first Education Minister, Martin McGuinness, commissioned the review body on post-primary education, whose report became known as the Burns Report. The report recommended that transfer tests should end as soon as possible. There was, however, no agreement among the political parties. There was also a public consultation, the results of which were mixed. By the time the consultation on the Burns Report was published, the Northern Ireland Assembly had gone into a period of suspension. Well, there's a surprise. During this time, a further review was commissioned by the Direct Rule Minister called the Post-Primary Review Working Group, known as the Costello Report. And its aim was to look at how the recommendation of the Burns report could be taken forward. The Costello report recommended that the transfer test should be abolished immediately and replaced with a system of parent and pupil-based choice informed by a pupil profile. Again, however, there was no subsequent agreement between the political parties about the way forward. Despite the lack of local consensus, the Direct Rule Minister accepted all the recommendations in the Costello report, and he said the last transfer test should take place in 2008. The UK government introduced the Education Northern Ireland Order 2006, which prohibited post-primary schools from using academic criteria to select pupils. On the return of the Northern Ireland Executive and Assembly in 2007, the Education Minister, Katrina Uwan, said that academic selection should cease, although this was done without the explicit backing of the Executive or the Assembly. In November 2008, the final government-run academic selection took place. Grammar schools and their supporters moved quickly to set up their own tests through two new consortia called AQE and the Post-Primary Transfer Consortium, which were largely used by state and Catholic schools respectively. As the tests were not run by the government, they were held on Saturday mornings in participating grammar schools, depending on which grammar school they wanted to attend. Some children did the AQE tests, some did the Post-Primary Transfer Consortium, and some children did both tests. In 2010, the Department of Education issued guidance to which schools must pay due regard, saying that post-primary schools should not use academic criteria to select pupils and that primary schools should not spend their time preparing pupils for unregulated tests. However, and this was a big however, as part of the political talks at St Andrews to restore the devolved institutions in 2006, the DUP secured a concession to the negotiations that would allow grammar schools to use academic selection if they wished. This meant that grammar schools were not compelled to follow the Department of Education guidance, and so they were able to continue to use academic selection via the new unregulated tests. In 2015, the Department of Education repeated the previous guidance to primary schools about not preparing children for the tests, but this was then reversed by the new Education Minister, Peter Weir, in 2016. In 2017, AQE and the Post-Primary Transfer Consortium held discussions supported by the Department of Education about establishing a single transfer test, but negotiations broke down. They restarted later, and it was announced in autumn 2021 that a single transfer test would be put in place from autumn 2023. That's the test I saw all the children queuing up for this morning to go into school. I thought they were coming here, but actually they were going to do the transfer test. Parents choose whether their children sit the test, although this choice is made in the context of most grammar schools requiring the children to sit one of the tests in order to gain admission. In November 2021, 8,280 children sat the AQE tests and 5,450 sat the Post-Primary Transfer Consortium test out of a total Year 7 cohort of 25,000. And while the transfer test in Northern Ireland may enable children from less privileged backgrounds to attend selective schools, data shows that students from lower socioeconomic status households are very much underrepresented in grammar schools. Northern Ireland's Department of Education data consistently indicates that there are higher concentrations of disadvantaged children in non-selective schools than in grammar schools. Using the Free School Meals Register as a measure of deprivation, 22% of Year 8 pupils entitled to free school meals attended a grammar, and I thought personally that figure was very high, because I know some grammar schools, in fact I know quite a few grammar schools where the figure is well under 10%. So we had 78% then of children on free school meals who attend non-grammar schools. Previous research has also highlighted the link between parental income and grammar schools and grammar school attendance, and the odds of those entitled to free school meals securing a place at a grammar school are nearly 5 times lower than others. Of course, advocates for academic selection claim the grammar schools offer significant social mobility, and they offer opportunities to disadvantaged children that are not available in non-selective schools. The idea that there was a golden age when grammar schools enabled social mobility is a myth. The Crowther report in 1959 showed that just 10% of grammar school pupils came from working class backgrounds, and 2/3 of them left without getting 3 O-levels. The report noted that 81% of working class students left before age 17, and only 0.3% of working class children achieved the 2 A-level benchmark. Grammar schools, in other words, did very little to promote social mobility. What social mobility did take place was attributable to the post-war expansion of white-collar jobs. The great gift Britain gave the children of the 50s and the 60s wasn't some exam, but an expansion of managerial and professional jobs, and created more room at the top for everyone. We have the most socially segregated system in the developed world. The OECD's 2012 benchmark placed us 34th out of 34 developed countries, the most socially segregated education system in the developed world, bar none. Over 50 years ago, the Coleman Report, Equality of Educational Opportunity, found that the most powerful predictor of academic achievement is the socio-economic status of child's family. And the second most important predictor is the socio-economic status of the classmates in her school. So, in other words, being born poor imposes a disadvantage, but attending a school with large numbers of low-income classmates, and that's what's happening in many, many schools in Northern Ireland now, presents a second independent challenge. The transfer test here acts as a filter for social selection. And what that means is that children from better off families go to grammar schools, and children from less advantaged backgrounds go to secondary schools. High poverty schools consistently fail to provide students an equal opportunity for an adequate education. All students perform substantially worse in high poverty schools. Stefan Collini, Professor of English Literature and Intellectual History at the University of Cambridge, when commenting on the latest international education statistics last year, explained that countries committed to high-quality comprehensives, such as Finland, yet again came out on top. A stratified and class-segregated system is not the answer, it's the problem. The emotional impact of the transfer test has been highlighted for over 2 decades in numerous academic reports. A report commissioned by the Department of Education and Save the Children in 2001 found that the majority of transfer test students were anxious and fearful about the test. A recent small-scale study carried out here in Northern Ireland found that 60% of the 300 children surveyed felt that the test was bad for them and it did not make them feel confident or able. Linda Hoddle, who failed the 11 Plus in 1965, gained a BA honours degree in sociology with history first class in 2002. For her degree dissertation, she interviewed 14 adults, men and women, who had failed the transfer test 30 years ago. And she asked them about the impact that failure had on their life chances and their self-worth. And it's just It's very, very interesting. This is what this lady Leslie had to say. My friend that I had grown up since we were 3, she passed and I failed. And she went on to the grammar school and I went to the secondary school. And that was the beginning of really feeling something was different. We were like sisters being ripped apart. Laura. So many of my friends went to grammar school and I never saw them again. So it broke up friendships because there was a looking down on. Well, I've passed for grammar school and you haven't. Warren. I had some friends I used to catch the bus with to junior school. And it seemed strange that I'd always assumed that they were the same as me. And then it became clear that they weren't. They were cleverer than me. I'm just going to look because I've only got 5 minutes left and I might have to skip a bit, which I don't really want to do, but I don't know if Fiona would give me an extra couple of minutes. I'm not sure. I'm looking pathetically at her. I'll skip a few of them. I'll do my best. This is what Carol had to say. Whilst it, as an event in a sense, is less immediate and it's gone away, the waves spreading out from the ripples that it created are still very much there. This is an old wound, and most people tend to leave old wounds alone. They may walk with a limp, but they've got used to it, even though it has all sorts of ramifications in their present lives. And some of them are actually very moving even now reading them. I've skipped a couple of them actually. Michael Morpurgo. Michael Morpurgo applied to go to his local grammar school when he was a boy, but he failed the 11 plus test. The award-winning children's author, famous for his book War Horse, explains what effect this had on the rest of his schooling and his subsequent career. Speaking the day after the Education Secretary, Justine Greening, told the House of Commons that more grammar schools would drive up the standard in English schools, Morpurgo described the shame of public failure. This is 1953. At such a young age and the damaging effect that it has on children. Morpurgo told the Press Association, failure is the worst thing you can do to a child. It crushes their confidence. I condemn myself because of this failure. You were named and shamed. You knew you had disappointed everyone. At home, there was silent disapproval and disappointment of the worst kind. This was my first public failure. There were many more to come. My early blithe confidence had been shattered. All schoolwork and all tests became fearful to me. When asked to read aloud or recite a poem, I stuttered. I longed only for playtime and the bell at the end of school. I'll talk quickly just about another wee experiment that was carried out by World Bank economists. In 2004, Carla Hoff and Priyanka Pandey, and I'll try to go through it quickly. And what actually happened was they took 321 children from rural villages in India. They took 2 sets, by the way, of 321. 321 low-caste children, 321 high-caste children. And they set them in the morning time, a set of little puzzles, mazes to do. And when they tallied up the results, there was very little difference between either group. But for the afternoon session, what happened was they had an announcer stand up on the stage and call out. Each boy had to acknowledge his name was called out, his father's name, his grandfather's name, his village and his caste. And the children were set the same tasks to do with more mazes. And this time there was a big gap between the children in the higher caste group and the children in the lower caste. Striking evidence that performance and behaviour in an educational task can be profoundly affected by the way we are seen and judged by others. When we expect to be viewed as inferior, our abilities seem to be diminished. And I'm going to very quickly. And what is all this pain and humiliation for? Those who support the present system will point to the fact that Northern Ireland consistently has the best GCSE, O and A-level results in the United Kingdom. But the price we pay in wastage is huge. At 30.5%, Northern Ireland has by far the largest population share with basic or no qualifications. At the upper end of the spectrum, Northern Ireland has the lowest share of individuals holding post-secondary qualifications, and only the northeast of England has a lower share of graduates. The National Education Union, and I think this was interesting, in their initial submission to the Independent Review of Education, they pointed out this fact, and it's a very interesting fact. Of interest in our socially segregated post-primaries is that our high flyers, the gifted and the talented, do poorly by international comparison. The tests that up to now have been used to decide the life chances of 10 and 11-year-olds have neither validity or reliability. At the height of the grammar school system in England, it was estimated that some 70,000 children a year were inaccurately placed on the wrong side of the dividing line. Gardner and Curran in 2005 analysed 3,000 tests to find that the tests were technically unreliable and could only be trusted to differentiate pupils in the top 12% or the lowest 18% performing pupils. The analysis showed that only 18 marks out of 150 spanned the 5 grade boundaries between the top A band and the lowest D band. The candidate ranking system had the potential to misclassify up to 2/3 of the sample by up to 3 grades. The tests do not adhere to any standardised conventions of statutory tests in the UK, and the tests are not underpinned by published standards of practice or technical fidelity. Maybe then. This year's P7 will be sitting the test in November. They've already had their education hugely disrupted by the effects of COVID, and they've lost most of their P3 and the P4 years, with only the minimum of extra support. And of course, we know that children from more disadvantaged backgrounds have suffered the greatest loss. These children are also the most likely not to sit the test, and again, they will be the biggest losers. Evidence shows that the selection process does have a significant impact on curriculum delivery in the final 2 years of primary school. Teaching in the period between the tests has a narrow focus on test content and test technique. Post-primary teachers reported that the focus on preparing children for transfer tests in year 6 and 7 meant that some children arrived in year 8, and I can testify to that over many years, ill-prepared for secondary school. Teachers reported having to start again in some areas. Because of this, many of this year's P7s will be moving on to secondary school, having missed so much of their primary education through a combination of COVID and an emphasis on preparing the others for the test. And this is me now. As Frank Connolly has pointed out in his 2022 Vera Foster lecture, what would an all-island education system look like? And what he had to say, this type of educational apartheid that we practice here would not be acceptable in any modern European democracy. Thank you very much. Thanks, Fiona. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jim. I think it was worth the extra couple of minutes.